So just want to welcome everyone to this latest webinar that was hosted by Multimodal. I'm the founder and CEO of Multimodal. As many of you know, we do workflow automation, particularly in regulated industries. And today I have two great panelists here to join us. I think the focus of this conversation is really around AI-powered compliance, how the regulatory environment has gotten reshaped over the last couple of years and will continue to get reshaped in the years to come. So I want to welcome two of our guests, and I'll give the floor to give the chance for each of you to introduce yourselves. But we have Richard White, who's the founder of RJL Solutions. He was just recently the Chief Data Officer at New York Life. And we also have Scott Jamieson, who's the Chief Compliance Officer at Revolut in Australia. Richard, Scott, thanks for being panelists on the webinar.
Thanks for having us on.
So Richard, maybe if you could introduce yourself very quickly, and then we'll do the same with Scott.
Sure. Just to give a bit more background on me, I have approximately 30 years of experience in data and technology. I've worked for many of the major financial services firms, both in banking and insurance. And just one observation, as Ankar had mentioned, out of my 30-year career, the last 5 has been amazing regarding the progress between cloud technologies and the progress in AI. I never thought the things that are possible now would be possible in the first 20 years. So hoping to get a bit into that as we move forward.
Good evening, North America, and good morning if, like me, you're in Australia. I am the Chief Compliance Officer of Revolut. Revolut is a global business headquartered in the UK, very large in Europe with about 40 million customers, and pretty small at the moment in the USA. We are a fintech, we're a bank in Europe, and we offer various financial services and banking products. I've been in financial services, risk and compliance for also the best part of 30 years now. And currently in the head of compliance role for Australia and the APAC region for Revolut. And also I echo what Richard's saying, incredible time that we're in at the moment with amazing opportunities.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Scott. And just to set the stage, I think obviously AI has a lot of good that it could do in the compliance landscape. But just as it is a tool for a lot of compliance teams to use to improve compliance, I think we also have to realize that the bad actors are also using AI. And that is a huge threat. So while AI is a huge opportunity to go and do compliance better, there's a massive threat that's happening. It's playing out right now around bad actors using AI to really trick different institutions, right? And the amount of financial fraud and other types of fraud that's occurring is quite large. And then this is an age-old problem. It's not new in many ways, but I think the pace of progress with AI, particularly generative AI, has made this a particularly thorny problem to go and solve. So what we'll do is we'll start off with a series of questions just for Scott and Rich to go through. And then what we'll do is we'll spend more of the time, the second half of the webinar, going through some of the questions that the audience has, and we'll try to cover the different areas that the audience may be interested in. To start off with, first question here, what are the pressing challenges in compliance and regulatory landscapes today? And maybe Scott, we'll turn to you first here.
Yeah, thanks, Ankar. Look, I think the point you just made around the bad apples is certainly an important one, and trying to stay one step ahead of what the fraudsters and the scammers are doing is certainly a major challenge and something at the forefront of every company working in financial services at the moment. I think for a compliance team, key challenges are the pace of regulatory change at the moment. So now I've worked in this area for many years, and I think now is the time that we're probably seeing more and more regulation coming in all across the world, and especially in the territories that I'm involved in. Some of that is trying to keep up to date with technology change, and certainly in areas in Australia we're years and years behind in our regulation, and it's now sort of trying to catch up to what's been developed, not just in AI, but really in technology overall over the last decade. I think the other thing we're seeing is a greater involvement by regulators in many of the jurisdictions. So where before they were probably a bit more standoffish and would only get involved where there were sort of real breaches, they have become more active, more investigative, and probably a little bit more interference based than they were previously.
I think that's super helpful. And I think, Rich, if you have anything to add, we could start that conversation. But
Scott had mentioned regarding a lot of that technology debt and a lot of the legacy that's out there. And with my experience as well, I've seen that, and a lot of that legacy and those legacy systems make it very hard to integrate into, as well as hard to unlock the volume and the variety of data that's available across the board as part of that. So looking at that, looking at the landscape and the modern platforms that are available to us on the cloud and addressing that. And as we know, there's quite a bit of resource constraints that we all have, from budgetary constraints to limitations and skill sets and personnel to make this happen. So between those factors, as well as Scott had mentioned regarding the regulatory scrutiny, there's also a lot more regulatory scrutiny on the use of AI, both traditional AI and generative AI. So they're around bias and transparency of the models and such as part of it. But unlocking the data foundation as part of this is going to be very, very important. And the data foundation used within inside of these tools and techniques is incredibly important as we move forward. So just a bit of a data perspective on things as well.
right. No, I think that's right. I think the data side of the house is just as important, right? And managing that. So I think to follow on that question, Rich, how do or how can AI solutions streamline KYC and KYB compliance processes in both banking and then in financial services? I know you have a lot of background in the insurance space, so I'm curious what your thoughts are there.
Sure. There's a couple of use cases that come to my mind, and some of them have been there for a bit of time. Things along the lines of document extraction and such. But with the use of new techniques, we really can take a document extraction like entity documents and passports, driver's licenses, utility bills, and drive structure from the unstructured side of this, and then work those through workflow processes around creating that automation. And as I had mentioned before, with a lot of the skill set and the resource constraints that we all have, being able to do that and combining our structured and unstructured data together is going to be important. So a lot of these techniques have been out there, but the combination of the different AI techniques now give us a lot more advantage than what we had before. The use of risk assessment and models and predictive models and machine learning within inside of that is important as well. So the use of assessments and screening processes as well, I think, is incredibly important. So I think that's a great use as part of the overall process, as well as fraud detection. And fraud detection, it just the vast amount of data that we have access to from publicly available data to our internal data that we can unlock to use as part of this. Fraud detection is an incredibly powerful way, and that is an important part of the overall process as well. So bottom line is there's a lot of use cases, and I think the possibility is endless as it relates to what you can do. But I think really the convergence of the different techniques, being able to draw context from our unstructured data, leveraging that with our structured data to build out the AI capabilities is going to be so powerful as we move forward.
Yeah, I think, Rich, just to kind of hone in on that, things I've seen, I've worked in the anti-money laundering space. I mean, that was a couple of years ago. We were using machine learning there to find patterns, particularly around transaction monitoring and for money laundering incidents. And I think the amount of data you need to really establish a core pattern and then assert what is anomalous in that core pattern, that's super important nowadays. And it's getting harder because you need more data to really catch some of the bad actors. And I think, we've certainly all heard about deep fakes, cloned voice, cloned images, fabricated documents. It's just getting a whole lot more sophisticated to a point where most of the document might be actually very realistic, but you might see certain fields that are altered in a way that's very, very hard to capture. And the only way to assert that is if you check all the different data layers, not just the image of the document, but the metadata, for example, with the PDFs, and making sure that there's a proper handshake from where the document originated. It's all those data points that need to be captured and then analyzed to be able to catch that fraud at the time it occurs, as opposed to after the fact, in which case it may be very hard to go and do anything about.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And thinking back in my early days of my career, and talking about metadata, and that metadata, and being able to cull that metadata out of the unstructured documents and use it in that capacity is so important. I never thought it would be so important, but it's getting more and more important throughout this process as well. So leveraging that metadata, being able to tag those documents, understand the content of those documents, and then drive it through the process. It's very much agree on her.
And I'm actually curious, how comfortable are regulators with AI solutions being maybe the first line of defense in some cases against catching some of the bad actors? Maybe Scott or Rich, either one of you, if you want to jump in on that one.
I can start, Anka. I think in some of those areas that you're talking about now, around fraud detection, around AML, it's actually expected by our regulators that our businesses will have the latest and the best technology to try to tackle the issues that we have in those spaces. So I think they're very open to it. I think there probably are some not necessarily concerns, but I think obviously that they're aware of issues around AI and the potential for errors if you get it wrong. But I think that it's already become the expectation in certain areas of regulation.
I would agree, and I've seen a lot more comfort with the regulators over the last 5 years of using AI in these types of capacities as well. So even putting around, but the expectation as well is to have some level of model governance around this, to show transparency regarding how you came up with that answer.
Yeah, it's a surprise, but 6 years ago, when I was really deep into this space, we were talking to central banks around the world, and they were just trying to wrap their heads around using machine learning, trying to understand what it is. But I think there was no way around it. I think there was no other way to tackle this problem without using very sophisticated software to really combat the very sophisticated attacks that the bad actors do. So I'm glad we're at that juncture. So I think to move ahead, and I'm curious who the key stakeholders are typically in these types of conversations around using AI, adopting AI for compliance within organizations, and what their particular priorities are, right? Because they do need a catalyst to go and make these types of conversations more top of mind and urgent for them to consider.
I might start with that, Richard. I think for a business like ours, there are a few different sets of stakeholders depending on where you sit in the business. So we run a traditional 3 lines of defense model where the first line of defense is the business itself that have responsibility for the controls. So the types of controls you were talking about before in the AML area around sort of KYC, KYB, transaction monitoring, that for us sits in the first line. And the key stakeholders there are the owners of the business, and the key things that they're concerned about are firstly compliance. So they actually want to make sure that we do stay compliant. They're concerned about efficiency, and they're concerned about costs, because for them, this is all comes into their bottom line. When we then, as a second line, as a compliance function, look at these things, we tend not to be as concerned about costs, but we're very concerned about the effectiveness of the result, and the accuracy of the result, and the provability and the traceability that Richard was talking about. So, different areas are going to look at different things. Lots of stakeholders in any decision about implementing, a new AI solution across the business.
So Scott, just sorry, Richard, just one quick second. I think what you touched on, we're seeing quite a lot of, which is a lot of the business owners think of cost reduction as the thing that gets them to move. And then when you get down to the compliance departments, it becomes much bigger, particularly around the accuracy, how effective it is. And then also things you mentioned, like being able to trace and explain sort of how the AI is interacting to catch what it is catching. I think that's exactly what we've seen firsthand too. Rich, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no. I was just going to add to what Scott had mentioned and seeing as part of the implementations as well. I think bringing in legal is an important party as well to have a perspective on data elements and variables that you use within inside of the model and help understand the risk as part of this as well. And an important piece is also including the data teams and the IT teams. There's so much and underneath the AI models and decisions that need to be made regarding platforms, models that you use, as well as training of those models. And I also want to emphasize, as Scott had mentioned, with the business sponsorship and leadership that's necessary as part of this to train the models, especially with unstructured data. The business knows the unstructured data best. And just to bring a correlation between structured and unstructured, technology generally has managed the unstructured side of this. The business has really managed the unstructured side of this. So bringing in the business partners who really know the documents and manage these documents on a day-to-day basis is incredibly important. So really bringing these groups together and as key stakeholders is important.
That makes sense. It's a multi-party effort there. And I think, just to kind of pick up on this question in the chat, because I think it is relevant to the conversation we're having. Have we actually seen operational costs decrease as a result of adopting AI for some of the like KYC, KYB workflows we're talking about, transaction monitoring and such? Or has that not fully played out yet? Because I know that's like the big incentive for a lot of companies to adopt AI, period. Not just in this area, but many areas of the organization.
I would say that it's probably a bit hard to answer for our business because we have had machine learning for some time and we've been growing very quickly as a business for that time. So I think what it's probably helped us do is not to have to staff maybe as much as we would have otherwise, but it hasn't sort of caused us to lose people at this stage.
Yeah, I echo that as well. It's really keeping that core in place and driving those operational efficiencies, especially as regulations become more complex, being able to handle more with the same or less.
It's surprising that's exactly what we hear with our clients. A lot of times, and we work in different areas, but they have really great people, the organizations we work with. It's not about replacing them. That's not really the core reason why they engage with us. It's to make them more superhuman at what they do, so they could be 3, 4, 5 times as productive and handle more volume. And that means you have to hire less, so it does change sort of the cost picture long term. You're able to have a much larger operation with the same headcount. But I think it's not really a people reduction play. It's about enabling them to do more. So I'm glad that we're seeing that play out in some of the work that we've seen on the regulatory compliance side. All right, so I think moving ahead, I'm very curious about the different individuals that have to come together to make basically like AI adoption happen. So how does AI complement the roles of individuals, for example, within the compliance team? And what strategies have you seen be successful in integrating AI into those workflows? Perhaps Scott, you might be best positioned to answer that.
Yeah, I might answer this one from the point of view of the second line compliance team, Anchor, which is the sort of functional area I'm responsible for. And I think we're still in the really early days here. I look across different processes that we're doing and I see a lot of opportunity. So in areas, for instance, where we need to go back to the core regulation and interpret that and explain it to the business, for example, at the moment, there's hundreds of different pieces of regulation in Australia. I'm sure it's the same in the USA that any financial services company has to comply with. It equates to thousands and thousands of pages of regulation, and even for a professional that's been working in it forever, it's hard to know and remember everything. The ability, I think, of AI to be able to digest that and then be able to feed that back in easily explainable terms to the business will be something that I see as being a really key enabler for our team in the future. Not something we're really doing yet, apart from some of our teams that are experimenting with ChatGPT to get fairly generic answers. But when we can have those large language models trained on the specific regulation and tested to produce the results, and I think that'll be great. So just being able to have a business question rather than spending hours having to try to go back to the source documents and find the answer, to be able to query a bot and basically get the answer, get the references that you might then need to go back and check the answer, can save hours each time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I certainly share that view from the work that I've done with clients, which is like the first thing that AI was really good at is pinpointing the potential areas where there might be fraud or some suspicious activity. So it narrows the scope for the set of humans to go and review. And then now I think you also see those same individuals, the people on the team, be able to find answers to questions that they need. So the information retrieval from knowledge that has been accumulated and stored within the organization. So first, you do need knowledge management layer to be there, but then enabling really great information retrieval and querying, that makes people really, really good at their specific roles, right? So I think that's where AI comes in. It's like people still are the final ones that decide, but can we arm them with the tools they need to be really, really effective? Otherwise, they may be spending time in areas they really don't need to be. Right? I think that's right. Okay, well, I think maybe we'll turn to Rich for this one here, but I'm very curious where you've seen successful adoption of AI in some of the compliance processes that perhaps that you've worked on. And I think it's always good to hear where AI has been effective, but perhaps equally important is where AI has failed. Maybe it hasn't met expectations. Could you maybe share a story or two that could help inform some of the work that even people in our audience are considering here?
Sure, and I think with the customer experience, and I always try to look at this from the customer experience and the customer lens as part of this. So helping guide through the overall experience, not just the back end around the validation, verification portions of it, but that guided experience around this. So that process is much more streamlined and easy, and not needing to go through multiple steps and wait times and those types of things for account opening and those types of processes that are out there. So I see a lot of this and the leverage around this focused around customer experience. I think that's critical. And we touched on this a bit before, and this has been both a success and had some stumbling blocks or some limitations as well. It's around knowledge base and using compliance documents to have and ask questions of as part of it. And data quality is so important with this, and structuring of documents and tagging and such to really drive the outcomes that you're looking for as part of this. So training those models, having the right tagging behind those so you get the right answers is a significant amount of work. So where there's higher quality documents and higher quality data, we're seeing a lot better results as opposed to where there's less quality data. So in many cases, as we had mentioned before, removing the human out of the loop, in many cases, is just not possible. It's really making people better as part of it. So the technology, in many cases, is just really not there. And looking at some of this and some of the experience that I have, and you can log on to ChatGPT, right, and ask it anything, and you can upload documents and PDFs and scan them and ask questions as if you can upload a textbook and pretend it's a tutor as part of it. And people think it's that easy behind the scenes. There's a lot of moving parts behind it. So you can't underestimate all of the training, the data, and the teams that need to come together, as we mentioned before, to really make this happen as part of it. And we touched a bit on fraud detection as well. I've seen a lot of good use cases, not just with KYC, but outside of that as well with fraud detection as part of this. So those are just a couple of use cases that come to my mind as well. So even thinking about and just looking at an experience of myself that I had myself, I'd opened an account with a major bank, an online account, and then I opened up the credit card, and I made some transactions on the credit card, and that account got flagged, and basically there was set of transactions on the credit card and then a payment coming in from a bank, they actually didn't know it was their bank. So the importance of interoperability of the data and understanding the two sides of this and connecting those dots and then being able to leverage those is so important. And it actually took me about 2 weeks to unwind. And the moral of the story is I actually had to call the credit card company and get the bank on the phone with me at the same time to resolve it myself. So the customer experience is so important as part of this, and that has a lasting impression. You know, it's getting a little bit of buyer's remorse, really whether I wanted to move forward with this or not.
That's a great
I think that's a
story.
great. I think that's a great example, Richard. I think it's really hard, particularly in that area of AML compliance, to over comply and to block transactions and to flag customers and to raise false positives. And one of the major challenges is to get that balance right, where you have your risk settings so that you don't overly comply and don't overly affect customers who just shouldn't be affected, because what their transaction has done really is nothing really out of the ordinary. It's just that it looks a little different to normal. And having all the data points and the ability of an engine to assess that and to help judge whether something should be flagged or not, I think is incredibly important. I think a company like Revolut, that's a constant battle. Not to block people's accounts that have done nothing wrong, and it's probably the area that we and most other financial companies get the most complaints about. If we can really leverage AI to give us a much better view as to what is legitimate transaction and what isn't, that's a huge step forward for customers.
So Scott, I actually wanted to ask you, or maybe Rich, either one, if you could pick this up. But Liz was asking, how come companies companies such as Stripe, why don't they tell clients what they're working on? And it would help to know the approach as a customer. I have some thoughts on it, but Scott, I mean, I don't know if you've encountered that. Obviously, Revolut's obviously a very fast-growing company as well. I'm sure you have to choose what to disclose and what not to. So how do you think about what to reveal to customers versus like keeping close to the chest here?
Yeah, it's difficult, particularly in the AML area, where you can't actually reveal to a customer the reason that you might have flagged an account, because that's counted as tipping off the customer that you've actually got a suspicion. So in those sort of individual circumstances, you tend to sort of give very generic responses, and that can really annoy customers as well, because they don't understand what is it that I've done. Unfortunately, from a regulatory perspective, there's not much we can do about that. It would be great to be able to explain, what we're doing a lot of the times, but that's not something that we're actually able to do.
Yeah, I mean, and I could speak to some of this as well. I mean, working in this space, you actually don't want to reveal exactly what the secret sauce is for both catching bad actors, because that also it informs the bad actors on like how to evade, right? How to get around. The other thing is that these models now are so complex, they're taking in so much data that it's hard to explain all the different factors that fed into why something got flagged, because you're looking for, in some cases it could be hundreds of different factors, and you're looking at the confluence of a couple of factors that are anomalous, and the fact that they're anomalous together, right? Any one of them as being an anomaly might be fine, but the fact that they're anomalous together is very, very rare, and it's indicative of some type of bad activity. And that's why I got flagged. But then it's hard to unpack and say, well, how much did each little factor weigh into that final decision? So,
I think we could probably never explain all that to the customer. I think what's really important, though, is that we can explain that to a regulator, and particularly in an area, not so much in the AML area, but when we get to credit scoring, for instance, and you have customers who you're granting loans to or not, on the basis of their score, which takes into account all sorts of data points. We need to be able to trace that and to be able to explain why a model has made the decision it's made. So, Richard talked about transparency at the outset. That is definitely something that we and that the regulators need to see. It's not enough just to have a black box that someone else has developed and say, oh yeah, we've tested the outcome for accuracy and it looks accurate. You need to be able to explain on an individual case basis, why the machine has made a decision.
Yeah. And maybe we turn to the other question, and maybe Rich, I think this might be more appropriate for you, but obviously the big worry with models and data in general, use of data, is the data itself could be biased, which could lead to biased models. And so in the world of compliance, as we look at some of the ethical considerations or implications around deploying AI, maybe that's been trained on a particular subset of data that has some bias in it and may influence future decisions. I'm curious how you've thought about this problem and found ways to address in the work that you've done.
Sure, and I mentioned it a bit before regarding ensuring that you have strong model governance and all the right folks around risk compliance, legal, technology, and the major stakeholders all in play as part of this. And as developing the models, understanding the data and the variables that are going into those models, and then ensuring if those variables are going to create a bias as it relates to the outcome, potentially things like income or geography or certain other pieces that may sway the model one way or another. And ensuring, as we had mentioned, around that transparency around how that decision was made. And I also think it's important, and we've mentioned several times around data quality, but understanding the lineage and where that data is coming from, how you got it and how you're using it, and being able to document that is so important. So looking through that and being able to explain that, and if there's scrutiny on outcomes and those types of things, just ensuring that you have that documentation, you have strong processes in play, all the right parties are at the table, and then you can adjust over a period of time. And keeping that consistency regarding that is important as you move forward. So having those guardrails or constraints, I hate to call them constraints, but those guardrails around the implementation, I think are so important. So bringing those pieces together around this, and it also requires a strong data governance program to make this happen behind the scenes. I know we haven't focused quite a bit on, or we haven't focused much on that today, but we could probably do a whole webinar on the back end side of this around the governance and the quality. How do you bring this together? What's necessary really to bring together a model, ensure it has the right transparency, and then oversight, especially for critical decisions.
Yeah. No, I think those are incredible points. I mean, I think outside of large language models, if you look at just traditional machine learning models, data governance, model governance, being able to trace decisions, have some explainability, critical factors. And obviously, Gen AI is kind of the next hot thing that's playing out right now. And it is a problem. It is harder in many ways because it's harder to have model governance, data governance when you're relying on a foundation model that's been trained by one of the 4 or 5 major giants. At the same time, you do need that. Otherwise, it won't be enough to say, oh, OpenAI model, like that's what we used, and they got this thing wrong or that thing wrong. So the same principles apply, just a matter of how can you apply them here. And then large language models, they're very nuanced and sophisticated, but explainability is a huge problem, much harder than what I would say is the case with classical machine learning. You don't even have things like confidence scores to rely upon, right? And so you do need to somehow introduce those capabilities in order for this to work in production. Otherwise, like you have something that kind of works in a proof of concept environment, but you could never put it into production because you don't have a means to go in and discuss model governance and data governance and being able to kind of trace the results and explain to regulators why certain things were decided one way or another, right? So I think it's a huge problem that we'll have to, as a industry, go and try to solve.
Yeah, and one other thing that comes to my mind, Ankar, is that what we've done on several UIs, especially with generative AI, we ask the user to give us a confidence rating, whether it be a score or up and down, and we feed that back into the model as part of it. And as I had mentioned, especially with Gen AI, keeping human in the loop to keep that oversight, if you will, and those guardrails in place with the human as well. So that's been one of the keys as well on the generative AI side, outside of the traditional AI side, where it's a little bit more established, as you had mentioned, around those guardrails and familiarity of how to handle that with data governance.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the humans are still the final decision makers, the final points of control, but I think even for internal teams that are using large language models to improve maybe the scope of work that they can do, having some way for the human operators to be able to figure out why did the model get a certain result, like what context did it use, I think it's very, very helpful. And I think we will start seeing some more innovation there, at least more need for that to be part of the solution, the application layer, for example, that's built on top of the foundation models. I think that's going to be a core part of everything that we see from this point forward. So maybe we touch on this other question that came in, because I know it is top of mind for many organizations that we speak to, and I imagine for companies that are not at Revolut scale, or Richard at New York Life, I'm sure you had a larger scale to work with. But how can smaller financial institutions, fintechs even, startups with more limited resources, if they're building in this space where they have regulatory scrutiny, how can they implement AI solutions for compliance in a way that is cost effective without having to build all of that in-house?
Yeah, I'll throw out a few ideas as part of it. I think with my experience is ensure that you have clear and well-defined objectives of what you want to get out of it, and as well as prioritize your use cases, I think is an important piece. And starting out and looking at the number of ideas that you get when you're brainstorming, it's hundreds, right? And you can't accomplish hundreds of ideas, and really looking for where there's an ROI, where, whether it's efficiency or other plays that may be important to your KPIs, your outcomes that you're looking to do. So between clear objectives and outcomes, I think it's important. As well as utilizing third parties and off the shelf, open source and those types of things, I think is very important as well. So just a few ideas that are out there. And I think these ideas apply not only to small but large companies as well. The backlog of Gen AI and, just the public availability of it, and the focus on it in the media and such, brings it at everyone's fingertips. So there's so much that people think that they can do with this and want to explore with, and there's such a backlog with it as well. But it's really around prioritizing it, in my experience.
I think that's right, particularly like the last points about the availability of OpenAI. I think from some of the most recent articles I've read, something like 20-25% of companies are adopting AI now in some kind of project, and 75% of workers have already done it, and they're bringing those things into the office and actually using the tools already. So even for the smallest companies, their employees are already using generative AI to help with their tasks. So they actually already have adopted it in some way. And I think there's probably a lot to be learned from the individuals who are using it to actually help the companies work out where the best efficiencies are, that they could actually adopt some of these models themselves and roll them out to all of their employees.
Yeah, it's incredible how much of it has also been bottom up, not just top down, because people want to use technology to make their jobs easier, particularly on aspects that they don't need to be doing quite as much of. So we're seeing pressure on both sides. And then the business at large, including legal and compliance, is trying to figure out how to do this where it's seamlessly integrated without violating maybe some of the kind of regulatory things that they have to abide by. So let's move maybe to the next question, and I think this is a really important one. Obviously, I think there's a lot of hope and desire, a lot of aspirations around the use of AI to improve compliance. But I'm very curious what some of the common challenges are that organizations face when trying to adopt AI for compliance, especially maybe perhaps with some of the newer models and newer techniques. And then I think the next question related to this is, how can those challenges be mitigated or overcome? Perhaps maybe we start with Rich, and then Scott, would love your take as well.
Sure.
And with those, and I mentioned some of these before as it relates to some of the risks, as well, and looking at it and assuming that you could do something very quickly as part of this, ensuring that you have those frameworks and guardrails that are out there. I've also seen resistance as it relates to some of the initial exploration. Will this, eliminate my job? And what am I doing? And should I participate in this because it could ultimately mean that I'm out of a job that I currently do today. So let me kind of harbor some of that knowledge, that's out there. And we also mentioned about the transparency and all the legacy and the data silos that exist to unlock a lot of the capabilities that we're talking about here. And many companies, and if not most companies, really haven't had large investments in modernization. And a lot of their architecture and how they've grown up has been more organic as opposed to planned. So there's a lot of weight that needs to come together to really create this modern data environment to power a lot of what we're talking about here. So there really needs to be a balance as well between foundational implementation of these capabilities around data, but balancing that with outcomes and benefit as well. So not just a foundational program to remediate this, but really driving that foundation to remediate so you can get to that next level. So that's really what I've seen regarding a lot of the limitations that are out there. And one other one that I'll mention is skill sets. There's a lot of skill set gaps, not only within inside of the business and how they manage it. And as I had mentioned before, tech generally manages the structured side of the data within inside of databases, and it's seen as a technology problem. It's the opposite for the unstructured side of where the business needs to be much more involved. They really need to understand the content of their document. They have to help tag it. They have to help validate the outcomes of these models as part of it. So the business involvement is significantly different and turns the tide, but also the technology skills that are necessary on the other side to implement this and be able to support this at scale is much different than the traditional IT that most of us are used to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think Rich, just to touch on what you said, I think it's super important that I think traditional software is just engineers build and then you don't need a whole lot and then it's done. I think with AI in particular, you need the engineers and the data side of the house to go and prepare the data, but the data curation, how it gets tagged, how the model's built is very much informed by the business side, the subject matter experts, domain experts, and it's a confluence of that domain knowledge that's being embedded with the data that's been curated to train a model to be able to help people in those roles be more effective. And so multiple parties are involved, which I think makes AI particularly hard to go and build, but when built well, it delivers tremendous value. And I think that's kind of the chasm that a lot of companies get stuck in to do that well. Scott, I would love your take on this as well here.
Yeah, I think if I could add from the perspective of a second line compliance team, my biggest concern, or my team's biggest concern, is really around the accuracy of what these models are generating, particularly where the end result is something that impacts a customer. So, an example I can give you is a recent rollout that we have done of our chatbot, which we've just introduced to a large language model, one of the main providers, which is it has ultimately resulted in some amazing results for our customers and greatly improved efficiency. But we were quite concerned that with the accuracy of the results that it was given. So we did an awful lot of testing first on the accuracy. And then when we came to roll out in Australia what had been developed for Europe, we actually found out through our internal testing that it was giving results that weren't accurate for Australian customers. So the model had been trained on frequently asked questions. It had been trained on Australian ones. Some of those questions weren't accurate in the first place. So we actually had to go back and revise the data that the model was trained on. And then the model itself was defaulting, if it couldn't find the answer that was specific to Australia, it was defaulting back to providing UK answers. So we had to do a fair bit of work to make sure that the model was actually providing the right answers to the right customers. So I think that's kind of a similar concern that I'd have for any model that's introduced. Have we done enough testing to ensure that this is accurate, that it's not providing bad responses? So that's probably one of my main concerns of the risks. that the model is right, because people expect that anything that comes out of a machine is going to be accurate. And I think probably a lot of those expectations are maybe unreasonable expectations, because if there were humans answering the same questions, there's no way that a human would be, that every human is going to be entirely accurate, and yet that's what our expectation is of a machine model.
Yeah, it's a high bar, clear. But it's the thing that I've always heard, and I completely stand by this, is the second best answer that a model can give is no, I don't know what the right answer is, right? Because the worst thing that a model can do is with confidence answer something that could be particularly wrong and do it at scale, and then that starts having bad downstream consequences. So I think that's very, very important to get done right. And I think that to be obsessed with accuracy, I think is the right trade-off. Why don't we turn to another question, which is obviously there's a lot of value that AI can deliver, but as we've discussed on this call, there are huge challenges, right? On the data side, on the modeling side, on the use of the different capabilities that the models end up delivering to business users. And what is the best way to conduct a ROI analysis to figure out if AI is the right answer to a particular compliance problem, a particular compliance challenge, and how should organizations think about investing in AI? Because it's not a trivial investment, right? I think that's very clear from this conversation.
Richard, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. And just thinking of some of the experience from an implementation side of this is, Scott, you had mentioned a bit about this around measuring accuracy. And as one of the key methods of indicating of how much or the value out of what you're going to get out of it, is it worth the effort based on the accuracy that you're going to get outside or the other side of this. So I think your illustration that you had there was very, very key. And as I had mentioned before, of really looking at the use cases and prioritizing those use cases and starting small and iterating through is incredibly important. As well as efficiency and automation rates. I think doing more of it the same is very important. So if you get a large uplift by automating some of these repetitive tasks, I think is another key aspect to look at of whether you should use the model or not. But again, it all goes back to the accuracy and the training and such to make that happen. I was also thinking about my use case that I had before. And it's time to resolution. Took me 2 weeks to get my issue resolved. As part of it, it was a pretty bad experience. And it really, just like you had mentioned, Scott, I couldn't get much out of what the problem was, but I basically had to bring the two sides, the bank side and the credit card company side together to talk through this, to manage this, to unfreeze the account, to make the transactions go through as part of it. So also looking at things like time to detection to resolution from a customer experience is important, as well as looking at the customer experience. Is it a much better customer experience? There's a lot to be said, and the expectations that are out there, and at least my expectations is I expect this stuff to work, and I expect it to be quick, meaning I don't want my experience to be elongated. I don't want it to be a 30-day process or a 2-week process. I want something and I want it now. I want immediate gratification and the movement forward as part of it. So those are some of the aspects that I look at of, regarding use cases, with that. And there's some quick wins. In my implementation side, I look for some of the quick wins, see what we can get out of it, get some experience. Yeah, there's so many models out there, and this environment is changing so quickly. If you ask me today what my recommendation would be in 1 month from now, it's probably going to be slightly different. So looking at this and looking at the technology and what it takes and the progression of this and how fast it's moving is important moving forward as well. So that's just some perspective that I have. Any other thoughts, Scott, that you would have on it?
I think the ROI is going to be key to prioritization, because any company at the moment can probably look across 50 different areas of their company and say, yes, AI could improve this process. So then it comes down to a question of where do you start? And there's probably some low-hanging fruit where it's really obvious that you'll get cost reductions, you'll get time improvements, and then it becomes a bit more tricky the further down you go. I think customer experience is very important, and sometimes it can be a little bit hard to measure the return you get out of the improved customer experience. But if you can correlate that experience to the customer stickiness, to improved usage of your product, then I think you can get metrics that will help you calculate a return on investment for those areas as well. So absolutely, you're not going to be introducing these unless you're going to get some sort of return on your investment. And I think there'll be some areas where it's going to be very high, other areas that will probably have to wait because there's too many other priorities within a business.
Yeah. I'm curious, should companies jump in very earnestly into using AI for compliance, or is this something that potentially companies can kind of sit on the sidelines, have a wait and see approach, and maybe adopt this when regulators really push it upon them, right? And I'm sure it's different for different sized orgs, but the question is like, how urgent is this really? And is it safer and easier potentially to wait for the regulation to be clear around like whether you should use AI or how to use AI? Or are you seeing that a lot of businesses are doing it themselves because they just absolutely need it to have really great compliance practices today?
I think it comes down to a mixture of the ROI and the need for good compliance. So, if there's something that can really be improved from an efficiency basis, I don't think many companies are going to wait to see if there's additional clarification. I think they're probably going to go ahead anyway because they can see huge cost savings in introducing some kind of AI model there. In other areas, and we talked before about fraud detection, I think that it's because of the expectations of the regulators that we really need to move there. And that's also, I think, combined with the impact that fraud and scams are having on customers as well. We don't want to be in a position where our customers are being affected by those things. So if we can introduce new processes, new ways of using AI that are going to protect our customers, then we're not going to wait for that either. So, I don't think there's a need in most instances to wait for regulation. I think that we can look at some overlying principles that whatever comes out in terms of regulation, it's going to be around safety, it's going to be around accuracy, it's going to be around some ethical considerations. And if you think of those things already, I don't think there's a need to wait.
Mm-hmm. I think that makes sense. And then why don't we turn to Vanessa's question here, which are what measures are in place to ensure that AI-driven compliance processes maintain transparency and accountability? And I think that might be transparency and accountability for users when they're receiving various decisions, but I think it's also the other parties that care, particularly regulators around some of this. So maybe Scott, this might be best suited for you as well.
So just going back to Vanessa's opening question, Anchor, can you just repeat the first part of it?
Yeah. What measures are in place to ensure that AI-driven compliance practices maintain transparency and accountability, right? So just having greater visibility into how certain decisions are made and how that affects the end users.
So I think it's really important that the businesses that are putting these processes in place themselves understand how those models work and how those processes work. They're the ones that are going to have to explain to regulators, potentially have to explain to customers why the models have worked in certain ways and produced certain results. So as you said, it's not enough just to take one of the big producers of a large language model, put it in place and just have it spit out results where you yourself don't understand what those results are. So that would be the first thing to understand it, and then just test the model as much as you can to make sure that it's providing the results, and actually then try to trace back and work out why did the model behave in a certain way in a certain case, so that when something similar comes down the line, you can actually understand and explain that to a third party.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer there on that one. One final question, and would love an answer from each of you to close this out. What's one major thing that's exciting for you in using AI to solve a particularly thorny compliance problem that would have been very difficult, let's say 5 years ago, potentially with Gen AI or large language models. AI is maybe more able to take on. Because I think a lot of what AI is forward looking, right? I'm curious where you think it could be applied in one area specifically that you're excited by. Rich, maybe if you could start with that.
And I think the combination of use cases of where you could use the multiple AI capabilities between your traditional AI model, predictive models, as well as your generative models to provide context to this and the ability to train them in a different way, as well as draw out context from them. So I don't think it's just a compliance use case. And so many times, I've worked at regulatory agencies and other financial institutions of where we're looking at large masses of documents and looking for different sentiment within inside of those documents, and then creating pointers back around how do you address these, and then you want to address them through workflow. So I think the big use cases are really going to be focused around the combination of using multiple AI techniques that are out there to drive the value, and then bolting those together to drive the value overall. So that's just one example, that's out there. And one of my final thoughts is, just get out there and experiment with this technology. It's so widely available, and there's so many things you can do yourself, and it really gives you a refreshing idea of the power of it, especially with generative AI, and how you could apply it to your business problems as well. So I encourage everyone to get out there, experiment, and start being creative with what you could do. And that's really where I think that synergy between those multiple techniques of coming together to really drive it is going to drive a significant amount of operational efficiencies. As part of it, you couple that with workflow and other capabilities on the other side of it, and you can integrate it into almost any system that's out there, whether it be compliance system, whether it be for call centers or any other capability within the enterprise.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I think we're right at time. So Scott, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
No, I think that's fine. We're at time anchor. That's no problem.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate Scott and Richard, both of you, for joining as panelists on this. I think this is kind of an opening shot to really the conversation around AI and the use of AI around different things that are happening on the compliance front, and would love to revisit this in the future with both of you, perhaps on a podcast or so. But really appreciate the time today, and I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining as well. We'll make sure everyone receives a copy of the webinar as well. Enjoy the rest of the evening, and thank you for the time here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.